UA Analytics. We are used to thinking that the history of humanity is a path of progress, but in reality, it is a story of survival. Thousands of years ago, the rules were simple and harsh. There was no discussion about equality. There was a natural division of roles shaped by instinct. Primitive society was based on patriarchy, but it was not a dictatorship of strength. It was a dictatorship of responsibility. The man was responsible for the external sphere: hunting, protection, resources. He ventured into the dangerous world to ensure survival. The woman was the internal sphere. Her role was the reproduction of life. In conditions of high mortality, she was almost constantly either pregnant or nursing. This was not a choice, it was a necessity. During this period, she became dependent on the man. His duty was absolute: to protect and provide. He created a safe space where life could continue. This is how the basic code was formed: man, security and resources; woman, preservation and reproduction. This logic was also reflected in culture. Most religions and spiritual systems were formed around male figures, those who took on risk and responsibility. And it was not about superiority, but about function. Those responsible for survival set the rules, others ensured their preservation and transmission. It was a system of balance. Some create, others consolidate. This model existed for centuries until, with the development of industrial society and the emergence of the feminist movement, women began to actively fight for their rights. One of the symbolic moments of this process was the protest of textile factory workers in New York in 1857. Women took to the streets, protesting against exhausting working conditions and meager pay. A few decades later, this movement gained international scale. In 1910, at the Socialist Women's Conference in Copenhagen, Clara Zetkin proposed establishing an International Women's Day of solidarity in the struggle for their rights. As a result of this long struggle, women in most countries gained the right to vote, access to education, and the opportunity to work on equal terms with men. But even though women gained more rights, they still participated much less frequently in wars or worked in physically demanding jobs such as in mines, on drilling platforms, at sea, in metallurgical plants, near blast furnaces, or on the construction of large infrastructure projects. The digital revolution gave a new impetus to changing the format of relationships between men and women. Just a few decades ago, people compared their lives to those of the people they saw around them: neighbors, colleagues, friends. Today, things are different. Now people compare their lives to idealized fragments of other people's lives on social media. Travel, romantic evenings, expensive gifts, perfect relationships. But these images are just fragments. They don't show everyday life, don't show conflicts, don't show difficulties, don't show reality. As a result, a new situation arises. Men begin to compete for women's attention not only with other men, but also with idealized images created by social media. At the same time, a new industry has emerged online: the relationship coaching industry. These are bloggers, coaches, and psychologists who offer courses for women on how to build relationships. At first glance, there's nothing unusual about this, but many of these courses don't teach partnership. They teach techniques of influence, guilt manipulation, control through approval, and isolating a partner from friends. It is well known in psychology that such methods are often used by people with certain personality disorders. For example, narcissists, abusers, or psychopaths. Such people possess specific psychological techniques for influencing others. And the problem is that these very techniques, which are harmful and destructive, are increasingly being included in mass courses and trainings for women. In fact, a strange transformation is taking place. What is considered toxic or destructive behavior in psychology is presented as tools for building relationships, although in essence these are manipulative techniques that have historically been used by people who were not entirely mentally healthy. At the same time, another interesting social phenomenon arises. Women quite actively discuss among themselves such practical techniques and methods of influencing men. Within circles of friends, in chats, on forums, or in those same courses, they share experiences about which methods work better, how to strengthen control over a partner's behavior, and how to make a man more manageable. At the same time, male communication usually looks different. Men discuss the details of family relationships with each other much less often. Their conversations are more often focused on work, business, or on how to earn money and provide for the family. As a result, a kind of imbalance arises. One side actively exchanges tools of psychological influence, while the other side often does not even realize that such mechanisms are being used at all. Another problem is that such psychological influence is almost impossible to measure. If a man uses physical violence against a woman, it leaves obvious traces, bruises, injuries that can be medically documented. But when the abuse is psychological in nature, it is much more difficult to prove. In cases where a woman uses psychological violence against a man, such actions often go completely unnoticed because there is no visible evidence like medical records of physical injuries. Of course, men who use psychological violence against women also exist. And today this problem is being discussed a lot. However, at the same time, the topic of psychological violence by women is much less frequently the subject of public discussion, even though it can be just as, or sometimes even more, destructive. As a result of these processes, new models of male behavior have emerged. In 2006, the term herbivore men appeared in Japan. This is how men who consciously reject the traditional role of the hunter in relationships are called. They do not seek to actively pursue women, start a family, or build romantic relationships. In Japanese culture, a man is traditionally expected to be the main breadwinner of the family, but due to prolonged economic stagnation, many young people simply do not feel capable of fulfilling this role. And in order not to feel like failures, they essentially withdraw from this social game. After Japan, similar trends began to appear in China. There, more and more men are coming to the conclusion that the financial demands placed on a potential husband have become too high. In many cases, a man is expected to have his own apartment, a car, and a stable high income. Despite the changing social role of women, the criteria for choosing a man often remain tied to the patriarchal model, where he is the main provider. For some young people, this seems like an unattainable standard, so they choose solitude as a way to preserve their mental health. In Europe and the USA, this trend has taken a different form. There, a movement has emerged called Men Going Their Own Way. Its supporters consciously reject marriage and the traditional model of family life. For some men, this decision is not only social or economic, but also psychological. For example, there may be a situation where infidelity occurs in a marriage on the part of the woman. The man files for divorce, meaning he is essentially the party who has suffered morally and psychologically from this situation. But even in such a case, as a result of the divorce, the property accumulated during the marriage is usually divided in half, and in most cases, the children remain with the mother. Some researchers compare this trend to the state of so-called learned helplessness, a psychological effect in which a person stops trying to improve an unpleasant situation, even when they have the opportunity to do so, due to past experiences of failure. Thus, a gradual transition began to take shape from a patriarchal to a matriarchal model of social relations. If the patriarchal model is essentially geared toward conquering new territories, building pyramids, launching rockets, in other words, things that often do not bring immediate benefit but provide strategic advantage, then the matriarchal model is more focused on social security, healthcare, and the quality of life here and now. Having gained control over their own bodies and the right to pursue a career, women began to choose to have children later and to have fewer children in order to provide them with a higher quality of life. This was facilitated not only by the expansion of rights, but also by broad access to contraception and abortion methods. In most cases, although a man's opinion may be taken into account, the final decision about whether to have a child or not rests with the woman herself. With the transition to the new model, women gained significantly more rights and opportunities. And although women are no longer pregnant throughout their entire reproductive period and are not constantly occupied with raising children, and in some cases even choose the child-free path, that is, to not have children at all, the basic expectations of men have remained virtually unchanged. As before, men are expected to have a stable income, be able to guarantee security, take on responsibility, and be a source of support. In fact, an asymmetry has formed. Social roles have changed, but expectations remain rooted in the logic of a patriarchal society. The man is no longer the sole decision-maker, yet he is still seen as the main provider of resources in the relationship. This creates internal tension within the system because the rules of the game have only partially changed. And when one side gains additional rights while the other continues to bear the old amount of responsibility, the balance begins to break down. So it's no surprise that in recent decades, birth rates around the world have been rapidly declining. If in the 1980s the average global rate was about 3.7 children per woman, today it has dropped to approximately 2.3. Across the vast majority of European nations, this specific statistical figure has consistently remained well below the population replacement level, which is currently about 2.1 children per woman on average. In Japan, it is about 1.2, and in South Korea, it is even lower than 1. The decline in birth rates has another important consequence: the aging of the population. In many countries, the proportion of elderly people is rapidly increasing, while the share of the young working-age population is shrinking. This creates serious pressure on the economy, increases the burden on pension systems, raises taxes, and some economies begin to experience structural crises. To compensate for the labor shortage, many countries are trying to solve the problem through immigration. Young people from regions with a more traditional or patriarchal social structure and high birth rates, which is usually characteristic of patriarchal societies with a high level of religiosity, are coming en masse to economically developed countries. For example, in Hasidic families, it is quite common to have 5 to 10 children, just as it is in certain countries with a Muslim majority. However, in many cases, these migrants face difficulties integrating. The cultural norms, family traditions, and social rules they bring with them often differ significantly from those in the countries that receive them. Because of this, integration is often difficult and creates new social tensions. Interestingly, similar social mechanisms were once observed in scientific experiments as well. In the 1970s, American ethologist John Calhoun conducted a famous experiment known as Universe 25. In a specially created environment for laboratory rats, nearly ideal conditions were provided: plenty of food and water, no predators, and no diseases. At first, the population grew rapidly, but over time the animals' behavior began to change dramatically. The social structure of the colony was breaking down. Some of the young males lost their status and were gradually pushed out of social life, unable to find their place in the existing hierarchy. They stopped defending territory, competing for mates, and fulfilling the roles that had previously been essential for the group's survival. At the same time, some pregnant females, due to the passivity of the males, became vulnerable to random attacks, grew anxious, and directed their aggression not only toward other individuals, but also toward their own offspring. Over time, such females became aggressive loners and refused to reproduce. Gradually, a new category of males appeared, which were called the beautiful ones. They completely withdrew from social activity, only eating, sleeping, and grooming their own fur. Despite the ideal living conditions, the birth rate began to drop sharply, and eventually the entire population disappeared. The Universe 25 experiment was conducted several times, and each time the result was the same. This experiment is often cited as a metaphor for possible social processes in human societies when a portion of men is gradually pushed out of social roles and stops performing the functions on which the traditional structure of society was built. There are also characteristic examples in human history. As long as Rome was governed by a strict patriarchal ethic, where duty to the state and family stood above one's own life, it conquered the world. A Roman of that era was a warrior and a master, whose will was law and whose discipline was the foundation of the empire. But at the height of its power, Rome began to soften. When resources became limitless and security became the norm, the focus shifted. Strict masculine virtues came to be seen as relics of the past. Society began to live for pleasure, emotions, and comfort. A gradual feminization of culture took place. Instead of military expansion, redistribution of resources and social benefits, instead of discipline, bread and circuses. Romans of the later era became so accustomed to comfort that they lost the ability and, most importantly, the desire to fight. They believed that their comfort would last forever. When a civilization becomes matriarchal in its essence, it becomes a victim. Rome did not fall in a single day. It rotted from within, losing its ability to defend itself. Weakness attracted strength, and the barbarians simply took what Rome could no longer hold in its hands. In 1980, a strange monument appeared in the United States. 6 enormous granite slabs, each nearly 6 meters tall, were erected in a field in the state of Georgia. The monument was named the Georgia Guidestones. The total weight of the structure exceeded 100 tons. The client was a man by the name of R.C. Christian. He stated that he represented a small group of people who wished to remain anonymous. The client's identity was known to the contractors, but they signed a non-disclosure agreement and committed not to reveal his real name. It is only known that during negotiations with the builders, this man offered a sum for the work that was several times higher than the market rate. Texts in 8 world languages were engraved on the stone. But that was not the most interesting part. On these slabs, 10 rules for the humanity of the future were written. Among them was a phrase that caused particular resonance: "Let Earth's population never exceed 500 million, remaining in balance with nature." This may be just a coincidence, but around the same time that the Georgia Guidestones were being erected in the United States, one of the strictest demographic programs in history was introduced in China when the country's authorities implemented the one family, one child policy to curb rapid population growth. A few decades later, China faced the opposite problem, a sharp aging of the population and a decline in birth rates. Therefore, the authorities first allowed families to have 2 children, and starting in 2021, the restriction was expanded to 3 children. Despite these changes, the birth rate in the country continues to decline. Of course, this could be just a coincidence, but the fact remains, since the Georgia Guidestones were erected, the birth rate has been steadily declining not only in China, but around the world. The Georgia Guidestones stood for more than 40 years. In 2022, they were destroyed, but they left behind a question: who sets the rules for the future? When we talk about power, we usually think of governments, presidents, parliaments, and state institutions. But in the 21st century, reality has become much more complicated. Today, there are financial structures whose influence can surpass the capabilities of many countries. For example, BlackRock. It is the largest investment company in the world. The assets under its management are estimated at around $10 to $12 trillion. To grasp the scale, that's more than the economy of most countries on the planet. That is why economists sometimes call BlackRock the fourth branch of power. The company owns shares in thousands of the world's largest corporations, technology companies, banks, energy giants, pharmaceutical corporations. In fact, a significant part of the global economy. But finance is only one side of the story. The true technological center of this system is the Aladdin platform. It is a complex financial risk analysis system that processes data for assets worth over $20 trillion. It is used by banks, investment funds, and even government institutions. This system is also used to predict potential financial collapses of companies and to redistribute investment flows. In fact, this means that the algorithms of a private platform can influence the movement of vast amounts of capital in the global economy and through them set trends and shape the rules of social relations. Let's give an example. In 2005 to 2006, an experiment was conducted in which female laboratory rats were fed genetically modified soybeans, and the effects on their offspring were observed. As a result, it was found that about 55% of the offspring died after 3 weeks. The newborns had lower weight, and an effect of genetically modified soybeans on fertility was reported. Another experiment conducted in 2007 to 2008 on mice showed that when fed genetically modified soy, by the 5th generation, the population lost its ability to reproduce, as it could not maintain the necessary birth rate. So what does BlackRock have to do with this? The point is that one of the largest players in the global genetically modified soy market is Corteva Agriscience, a company that, among other things, sells seeds and invests billions of dollars in biotechnological research, and is therefore naturally interested in scaling up this market. And BlackRock is one of the largest shareholders of this company. Perhaps all of this is just a coincidence. Perhaps this is a natural stage in the development of society, but the facts look quite clear. Birth rates are falling, and some men are gradually moving away from the family model. The social roles that have upheld the structure of society for thousands of years are beginning to blur. All of this allows us to look at the situation from a different angle. Perhaps we are facing not just a change in roles or behavioral models. Perhaps we are witnessing the beginning of a much deeper transformation, a transformation of the very institution of the family and human reproduction itself. Even today, technologies are beginning to change what has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Surrogate motherhood, sperm banks, egg donation, all of these are gradually separating the process of childbirth from the traditional model of relationships between a man and a woman. A new reality is emerging in which the creation of offspring may become not the result of a relationship, but a separate service. If this trend continues, the institution of motherhood as we know it may change radically. Gestation as a separate function, upbringing as a separate service, care as hired labor. Human connections, which were once the foundation of survival, may gradually become optional. The next step may look even more radical. Modern biotechnology already allows us to work with genetic material. Today, this means treating hereditary diseases. But the logic of technological development always moves further. If the possibility arises to remove a defect, so does the temptation to improve, optimize, enhance, or select the desired traits even before birth. In such a system, natural selection can be replaced by artificial selection, and then the issue is no longer just about family or social roles. The question concerns the very nature of humanity itself. Will it remain as it has been for thousands of years? Or will it become a product of engineering? And most importantly, who will decide what it should be? Because when not just the rules of the game change, but the very biology of the players, that's no longer evolution, it's a system reboot.